Kremlin for the violence. Now, China, along with India, did not support a resolution to suspend Russia over its invasion of Ukraine. World leaders condemn Russia over its invasion of Ukraine. The Chinese government is refusing to blame the country. Earlier this week, China denounced the civilian killings in the city of Bucha, but it once again refrained from condemning the Kremlin for the violence. Now, China, along with India, did not support a resolution to suspend Russia from the UN Human Rights Council on Thursday. U.S. officials say Russia also asked the Chinese Communist Party for military and economic aid for the war in Ukraine. Now, for more, I want to bring in Christopher Johnson. He is the president and CEO of the China Strategies Group and a former senior China analyst at the CIA. Christopher, thanks for joining us. You've got a lot of experience with China. What's behind this country's seeming support of Russia?
Well, I think there are several things. The first is that they see Russia as a partner in an alliance of both interests and in an alliance of grievances against the United States. In terms of interests, obviously Russia has a lot of natural resources, gas, oil, wheat, other commodities that China needs desperately. But in terms of the grievances, they both share a perception that the U.S. has been bullying the rest of the world since the end of the Cold War, imposing its will and using frequently what the Chinese like to call long-arm jurisdiction. And we see this in the aspect of sanctions against Russia, worries in China about similar sanctions being applied to them at some point. So they share this idea that basically the U.S. victory in the Cold War has been negative for the global balance of power, and especially for their particular style of leadership.
So the Communist Party of China has also kind of been portraying Russia as the victim rather than the aggressor right now. So how could that narrative benefit President Xi Jinping's own national interests?
Well, it does to some degree, in that if you take as the course, and the Chinese have been filling the pages of their propaganda newspapers of this over the last several weeks, that NATO expansion is the provocateur, if you will, of this crisis, and that therefore Russia's, as they like to call them, legitimate security interests have not been paid any attention to. The Chinese draw a parallel between NATO expansion and developing alliance structures in East Asia that the U.S. has been pushing, including enhancing the relationship, longstanding relationships with Japan and with Australia, but also bringing in India in the so-called Quad arrangement. The Chinese see this as evolving versions of an East Asian NATO designed to contain China's rise.
So China's been watching our actions very closely here. What do you think China is learning from the U.S. response to this war?
Well, I think they're learning several things. The first is that, and in fact, they don't necessarily care that much about what's happening on the ground in Ukraine. Their two main focuses in this process have been the following. One was to see, would the United States back up its rhetorical chest thumping with regard to sanctions, financial sanctions, and also technology restrictions against Russia? And secondarily, would the U.S. be able to hold together this complex multilateral coalition of itself and the Europeans? And they can't be liking the answers to either of those questions. Obviously, also, they've also been watching the performance of the Russian military on the ground in Ukraine and drawing certain conclusions about what that means for their military preparedness, say, vis-a-vis a possible invasion of Taiwan at some point in the future.
So on that note, what would a China-Russia alliance mean for the U.S. moving forward?
Well, I think obviously the main thing that it means is that there's an alternative worldview, if you will, that's being pushed here, an alternative view of what global governance should be like. You know, Russia and China, basically, they're not necessarily challenging the United States' leading position or an effort to overturn the rules-based international order. In China's case in particular, they're looking to make the world safe for the Chinese Communist Party. In other words, telegraphing the fact that they have a legitimate governing system that doesn't include democracy and a legitimate economic system that has some elements of socialism and communism built in. In other words, a third way somewhere between capitalism and socialism that works for them and potentially works for other countries in the world.
Christopher Johnson, he's a former senior China analyst at the CIA. Thanks for sharing some of your expertise with us today.